US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has warned that China is treating the global economy as a dumping ground for its cheaper clean energy products, keeping market prices lower. Now, China has a surplus of solar power, electric vehicles, and lithium-ion batteries it can ship out to other countries at cheaper prices, making it difficult for green manufacturing industries elsewhere to compete. Yellen is intent on putting pressure on Beijing during her upcoming visit to China, which has been pouring billions into clean energy for years and outpacing the rest of the world in the transition. Yellen thinks there's a lot to be gained from these investments, especially on the equity markets. And in a recent speech, she doubled down on the electric vehicle boom. Now, let's bring in Tim Waterer. He is the Chief Market Analyst at KCM Trade, and he joins us now live from Sydney. Great to have you here with us on the program. So first, a question on competition. I mean, isn't this simply free competition and a free market that Janet Yellen is talking about when it comes to the energy transition?
Nice to be with you, Ludovica. You could certainly make that case. I think if we look at the relationship between US and China, it's sort of been strained over the past decade, and this subject about clean energy seems to be the latest chapter in that. I mean, I think it comes down to a question of intent. So if China is making the case that, okay, there is a global push towards clean energy and we are making large investments in the billions and providing subsidies to aid that, as well as to try and boost our own economy, which has been struggling for the past few years, then I think it's hard for the US to sort of argue against that on the global stage. But if there's something more to that in terms of destabilization, which I think where the US is coming from, maybe there is something to that in terms of flooding the market. But that's hard to prove. So yeah, at this stage, hard to say, is it just sour grapes from the US, who are also on themselves pouring in billions to that sector? Or is it a case that China just had the head start and showed initiative earlier?
Interesting. And Yellen was talking about doubling down on this electric vehicle boom. But do you agree? Because a lot of analysts, but also automakers, are warning that there may not be a boom after all because of many critical points that have to do with the EV sustainability and the electricity. Do you agree?
Yes, to a degree I do. I mean, if you look at sort of the EV sales, I mean, there has been some volatility there. It hasn't always been an upward trajectory. If you look at per unit profit for EV makers, it's quite slim, and a lot of manufacturers are still losing money when they're making EVs. And in terms of, I guess, the components, of course, the lithium-ion battery, it has its drawbacks in terms of production and eventual disposal. So, yeah, I'm not convinced it is sort of the saviour for the environment in this case. But the problem is a lot of companies and governments have poured so much money into it now, it's hard to try and turn around. So whether we move ahead with EVs or whether we sort of explore some, like hydrocarbons and some other means of clean energy, that remains to be seen. But yeah, I think there's still a lot of questions over the EV sector at the moment, and that's played out when you look at the sales figures.
Interesting. Where do you see the competition going in the clean energy sector? As you said, the US and China, they've been pouring billions of dollars in the clean energy. What can be said about the Gulf countries and Europe? Do you expect, on the one hand, Europe to do more? And what about the Gulf countries? And will they transition from their own investments in oil and gas towards different kinds of energy?
Yeah, that's a good question. In terms of the Gulf countries, I think, if we look at sort of the oil giants right now and their capex, where they're allocating it to, still a large component is to the, traditional oil and gas. That's where they're making the majority of their profit from still. But they are allocating, capex to the sort of the new energy sector. So it's how they manage that transition going forward, as to how much or how quickly they can play catch up to other economies such as China. We know that the US, as I mentioned earlier, that they are investing billions and providing their own subsidies to that sector. The same can be said for the UK and the EU. So I think they're all sort of, trying their best, but they are, behind the curve in relation to China at the moment. So it's a case of, whether they can catch up or whether that's even conceivable, because a lot of this comes out as a numbers game.
Right.
And, when you look at those production numbers, that they do have that head start, it's going to be hard to catch up, I think.
Very, very interesting discussion, Tim Waterer. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Now let's take a quick look at some of the other top stories from around the world. Japan's markets opened lower on Thursday as the yen rebounded slightly against the US dollar from a 34-year low. The Nikkei 225 stock index fell by 1.08% in early trading hours. Despite the Bank of Japan's recent shift away from negative interest rates, the yen has continued to depreciate, prompting Japan's monetary authorities to consider intervening in the market to counteract disorderly and speculative currency movements. Former billionaire crypto boss Sam Bankman-Fried will be sentenced today in New York after being convicted of fraud and money laundering last year. While his defense is seeking leniency, prosecutors have argued for a 40 to 50-year prison term, citing his deception of investors and theft from customers. The impending decision has sparked impassioned pleas from various quarters, including former customers and investors, as they seek to influence the ruling. TikTok has launched a $2.1 million TV ad campaign in the US as the Senate considers a bill that might ban the app. The ads are hoping to highlight the impact of a potential ban on small businesses and urge senators to block the legislation. TikTok is facing uncertainty over its future in America, despite lobbying efforts and widespread user protests against the ban. And GameStop shares, which skyrocketed due to Reddit-fueled hype, have plummeted by up to 17% after the company reported a decline in fourth-quarter revenue. Facing potential losses exceeding $700 million in market value, GameStop announced job cuts and store closures. Despite its earlier surge, the stock had already dropped 12% this year, settling at $13 per share.